tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
The Supreme Court of Canada on Friday issued a decision on Bill C-69, which is often referred to by its critics in Alberta and elsewhere as the No More Pipelines Law. They found it to be largely unconstitutional. They said the government's expanded review process for infrastructure projects, including pipelines, was intruding outside of federal jurisdiction. This is exactly what the government of Alberta has been saying, and the government of Alberta had a bit of a victory lap on this that it decided to take. And do we have I don't see it on the clip list. I think we might have had a clip of Danielle Smith, though.
Now, today, Minister of Environment and Climate Change Stephen Guilbeault and Minister of Energy and Natural Resources Jonathan Wilkinson responded to this historic decision, upholding the rights of provinces to develop their resources. They tried to position this as a win. It is not. They confirmed their plans to bring legislation back to Parliament to amend it. Clearly, they simply aren't listening. Guilbeault does not seem to acknowledge how badly he lost. And Wilkinson, I heard him say that he hopes that this is the last time that we end up going to court. Well, there's one way to assure that. They need to drop their clean electricity regulations, and they need to drop their emissions cap.
Yeah, it was a bit of a weird thing. Actually, to be honest, Stephen Guilbeault was doing the Jugmeet Singh dance thing. He was like, he loses, but he's like somehow trumpeting it as a big victory. The federal government said, oh, yes, we welcome the guidance from the Supreme Court on, how we can better tweak this and refine this, and we'll continue to build on it. No, you lost. You lost, and you were called on trying to trample into provincial jurisdiction with abandon. So what does this mean for Canada and for the oil and gas sector? Kris Sims joins us every Monday. She is the Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and it is always a delight to start our week off with her. Kris, this was a rare win from the Supreme Court. We don't get many of those.
No, and we absolutely need to pause and celebrate it, Andrew, for exactly this reason. Well, number one, it's just a win, so it's really good to see. Number two, it's a huge win, not just for people who work in our natural resources industries, but it's also a big win for taxpayers. So we did the math a few years back, and we figured out that because Canada does not have its full pipeline capacity up and running, we've lost out on roughly $13 billion in taxes just over the past 10 years. And Andrew, that's just in federal income taxes of people who would otherwise have been working in the industry. That's not even touching like municipal property taxes or any other sort of revenue that the government would get from such projects. And when you try to think of what that kind of money would do, 13 billion, roughly speaking, would pay the salaries of about 60,000 police officers and about 60,000 nurses combined. So we're talking big money here for taxpayers. But more importantly, I think what you highlighted there was really important. That statement from Guilbeault, the guy's just not taking no for an answer. And so there was language in there that is a little bit concerning, where he says, we're going to quickly bring this back to the House of Commons and improve the legislation. So there seems to be this zealous attachment to this sort of, no, you can't do that within your own provincial jurisdiction, coming from the federal government, coming from the Trudeau government. So while we think Premier Smith is right in celebrating this is definitely a huge win for provincial jurisdiction, we still need to keep an eye on these folks because they don't seem to be taking this no as a no.
Yeah, I want to read one line from this that jumps out here. We are heartened that the Supreme Court of Canada affirmed our role on these core principles. This is of respecting the environment, Indigenous rights, and ensuring projects get assessed in a timely way. We will now take this back and work quickly to improve the legislation through Parliament. When the Supreme Court tells you that it is unconstitutional, and all it was there were some parts that were upheld as constitutional, but the core aspect that was at issue was found unconstitutional. They weren't saying, well, if you just did this, you would be fine, because the court took issue with the core purpose of this. That was the thing. It's not just, well, if you left out that paragraph, it would have been fine. They said, no, you don't have a right to do this. But that's the part that the federal government has missed here. And I don't know how they're going to get around that, but I fear that the lawyers working around the clock on the federal government's dime will find a way.
Yes, exactly. So that's a concern as well. And then going forward, if you just read the way the Supreme Court explained it, it just sounds like a straight up win for things like what Premier Smith was referencing there, the so called clean electricity caps that they're trying to impose on Albertans here, but also things like so called just transition. So, just transition is basically an idea coming from the federal government that they are going to transition Canadians away from our natural resources and to something else. And the transition part is for the workers and the employees within things like energy, trucking, construction, all of the stuff that keeps us warm and builds our things and makes this whole country function. That would have cost hundreds of billions of dollars just in the salaries alone. And so we were, at least I am, reading the Supreme Court decision saying, oh, well, maybe this is a good indicator that the federal government needs to stay in its lane. But their reaction to it sounds like they won this case. So it's still probably a big uphill fight.
One thing that I think is important to note here as well is that we've effectively given provinces a veto on this. If a province like British Columbia, where you used to live, says, you know what, screw this, we don't want pipelines here. If Quebec does that, we basically give them the right to do that. And it's actually quite astonishing that the federal government has tried to make a regime in which provinces that want this don't actually get the same level of control and autonomy over it. Because when Alberta's saying, yep, build it, we want it, yes, 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 the federal government's like, well, now listen here. I don't know, and that's really what's happened here. So they've given the right to the naysayers to have complete like carte blanche on these projects, but they've not given the analogous right to those who want pipelines.
It's almost like the federal government has an agenda and they're picking winners and losers in this. What was really good about this fight is that it wasn't just the province of Alberta. It wasn't just the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. We were actually an official intervener saying, yes, Bill C-69 is bad for Canada. We had our lawyer in court and all of that stuff. It was other provinces as well. It wasn't just Alberta out there fighting its lonesome fight in the wilderness. This time we had other major provinces on board. So this means, if you can picture it, the province of Quebec could not be told no if they want to have a new hydroelectric program. The maritime provinces, if they ever decide to, for some reason, use the natural gas resources that they are sitting on provincially, they wouldn't be able to be told no by the federal government. So it wasn't just one of those lone voice in the wilderness by Albertans fighting this. It was other provinces in on it too. It was really good to see this decision. Hopefully, it is precedent setting, and that means things like just transition and these strange electricity energy caps will hopefully go away.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part. In the common law system, we want to really hold to that precedent here because right now there is a federalism question at play. And I mean, when we saw the carbon tax come up before the Supreme Court, which did not go the way you and I wanted it to go.
No.
It wasn't really, does the federal government have a right to impose a carbon tax? It was, does the federal government have a right to manage this, or does the provincial government have a right to manage this? And the case was really about finding where we put the carbon tax in that federalism divide. Whereas on this issue, I think the government pretty clearly said, we believe this is a federal responsibility. And the court said, well, no. That's encroachment. That's mission creep. So I think in that sense, it will be helpful. And I mean, obviously, the government's going to try to navigate around it. I mean, my concern is that they're going to really grasp at straws here, because one area where the federal government does have a right to act is in criminal laws. And that's basically what they're doing with, like, to shoehorn in some other environmental regulations, and also under emergency powers. And we've heard some of the really radical environmentalists say that the government should have defended the carbon tax under emergency powers because of the climate emergency.
Yeah, I've run into that as well. So that was at the federal level, they were making that argument. I've actually even heard that sort of argument at municipal levels. So a few years back, when I was back in British Columbia, I was sitting in on an online, discussion program with the city of Vancouver. And the city of Vancouver was trying to do many things all at once. They were trying to install a virtual toll wall around downtown to nail people with fines and fees every single time they crossed it. They were trying to impose brand new mega parking taxes on any new vehicles that were parked on the street rather than ones parked in the driveway. So they were penalizing renters, the people who can least afford it, the ones who were living in the basement suites. And before me in the queue, there were several people who were interveners who were saying exactly that in their view, they were in such a moment of crisis and emergency for the entire planet that all of our other arguments were moot, and nobody was allowed to bring up anything like financial hardship, fairness, the freedom to own your own vehicle. All of that wasn't relevant to these folks. They said all that mattered was the emergency. Now, do we have people in that same thinking and line of thinking within the federal government? Probably. Hopefully they have other things to do, though, instead of coming back quickly and rewriting this legislation. But that sentence jumped out at me, and I'm concerned that they are going to do just that. Go back and try to rewrite it, but hopefully the Supreme Court would say, you know what we said, and go away now.
Yeah, I mean, if Vancouver were given completely free reign, they would just like put snipers up on the living Shangri-La, and anyone that drives a diesel or gas powered vehicle gets like shot on their way into downtown. So you don't want to give them emergency powers. But the thing that I find so shocking about this, and just to bring it back to the Emergencies Act of the federal government, that was a useful exercise in showing us what the government thinks is appropriate when there is an emergency. And we should all be very, very terrified of the day the government does adopt the emergency rhetoric to deal with climate, because all of a sudden, oh, well, no gas powered vehicles. You can't drive to work through the week. I mean, these are things that would sound absurd 3 years ago, but now we wouldn't find to be out of left field.
No, and especially if you look at other countries that are debating things like this, especially in their downtown.
France banned domestic air travel. It is illegal to take a flight within France now.
See, and this is where you get this mission creep so quickly. And this is why at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we want smaller, more accountable government. One, because it's bad for people's freedom to have this ever-encroaching, ever-burgeoning government. And two, we just can't flat out afford it. Like Vancouver was going to hire, parking cops to go around with these special iPads, I'm not kidding, and scan the vehicles to see what make and model and how new they were and decide whether or not they then need to be fined. Can you imagine the bureaucrats tasked with that sort of policing? And so imagine that now on a federal scale. Like, we're already flat broke. We're already more than $1 trillion in debt. We have unmoney right now. But that wouldn't stop a lot of these ideologues, unfortunately, from cracking down on things like this. So this is, again, bringing it back to the Supreme Court decision. This is why this is such a huge win, is because it was a clear correction to the feds saying, nope, these provinces are correct. They are able to produce and refine their natural resources as they see fit. And folks, it wasn't just pipelines. Based on how you could read the interpretation of this law, Bill C-69, it could be argued that, a gravel pit or a new highway or even a transit system built within the province's own borders could somehow be subject to federal approval. And so this is where this is such a good win for the Supreme Court to correct the Trudeau government here.
Yeah, and very much vindication for the Alberta government, not just Danielle Smith, but also Jason Kenney, because the Supreme Court literally took at face value effectively what the Alberta government had been saying about this from the get-go. So, well said, Kris Sims. We will talk to you next Monday. Thank you so much for coming on, as always.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.